Okay.
Morning, everyone. Thank you for joining us. Bear with us for a few minutes as more people start to join the Zoom, and we'll get started in a few minutes.
While we're waiting, if you would pull up your phones and think about responding to the question on the screen, what's the cause of Colorado's housing crisis, or what are the contributing factors? Just go to menti.com. You can either use the QR code or enter the numbers here, and it should take you to a place where you can enter your thoughts about these causes.
And if anyone on here has not used QR codes like this before, just turn your phone to the camera app and scan the box, and there will be a link that pops up that'll take you to a survey. Looks like a couple more folks have jumped in, so I'll just repeat the announcement that we're just waiting as folks join until we get right up to noon. But as you're waiting, please feel free to use the QR code or go to menti.com to participate in putting your ideas up on the screen about what kinds of issues are causing our housing crisis here in Colorado. All right, it's 12 o'clock. Oh, sorry, go ahead, Robin.
No, I was just going to say multiple answers are allowed. If you think there's more than one cause, you can enter several different causes because it's a big issue. So you may have several thoughts.
Yeah. It is noon, but it looks like we have new people jumping into the Zoom right now. So we'll give it one more minute before we start the program today. But if you're just joining us, we've got an interactive activity on the screen. So either use your phone to scan the QR code or go to menti.com and enter the code to put in your ideas of about what's causing Colorado's housing crisis. All right. Well, I think we'll go ahead and get started. So welcome, everyone. Thank you so much for joining us for this presentation today on the housing crisis in Colorado. My name is Chris DeGree-Kennedy. I'm the president of the Bell Policy Center since July 1st and am coming off of 8 years of serving in the state legislature representing Lakewood and Edgewater in Jefferson County. We at the Bell Policy Center, if you're not familiar with our organization, we are focused on expanding economic mobility for all Coloradans and have worked on a wide variety of issues, including affordable housing policy. One of the other things I'll just mention, since there is an election in 6 days, we do a ballot guide every year. We've been doing a ballot guide since we launched the organization in the year 2000. So we'll put a link in the chat so that if you're still working your way through any of the 14 statewide ballot measures, you can get our perspective on what these measures mean and what they mean in particular for economic mobility, racial equity, and tax fairness for folks in Colorado. So, Andrea, if you're listening, why don't we go ahead and drop the chat for the ballot guide, the link for the ballot guide into the chat. So the presentation we're here to talk about today is part of an economic mobility fellowship program that the Bell Policy Center launched about a year ago, where Robin Kniech was one of three awardees who became the fellows in this program. And Robin has been doing some fascinating work on a variety of aspects of the affordable housing crisis, tapping into her experience on the Denver City Council, but really exploring very deeply some of the things that have made this such a difficult problem to solve. And so there's a lot to talk about, and I'm not going to talk very long before I hand it over to Robin and Melissa to present today. But I will just say this based on what I saw at the legislature over the last couple of years. You know, there have been a number of policy ideas over the years to address housing, and a lot of the role at the state level has been dollars. It's been tax credit policies. It's been, as Mary Ellen just put in the chat, the Prop 123 units. But it's only been in the last few years that we've really grappled with one of the more difficult aspects of affordable housing policy, which is what happens when zoning and other local government issues are making it more difficult to get the land that we need in order to develop the affordable housing units we need for our growing population in the Denver metro area. And these have been very difficult conversations, whether it is the local control versus statewide policy debate, whether it has been the pressure from certain constituencies to avoid growth at all costs and to kind of preserve communities as they are. These have been difficult tensions to navigate, and these policies at the Capitol have gone through quite the process to get to where they did by the end, where we ended up passing a number of policies in the last year around accessory dwelling units, around transit-oriented communities. It was a few years before that we passed the policy authorizing local governments to use inclusionary zoning policies, and of course, grappling with the ever-popular parking policies. So without further ado, I'm going to hand it over to our panelists. We'll post their full bios in the chat, but first I'd like to introduce Melissa Mejia from the Community Economic Defense Project.
Sorry, trying to get off mute. Thanks for letting me join, Head of State and Local Policy. Happy to get to talk about the work that we've done over the last couple of years.
Thank you, Melissa. And I already mentioned Robin, but I'd like to introduce former Denver City Councilor and one of our Bell Economic Mobility Fellows, Robin Kniech.
Hi, everybody. Thanks for joining us today. And I'm really excited to have Melissa. She was very brief, but she has long served as a volunteer on a very demanding board dealing with land use on a regular basis on the Denver Planning Board as well. And her full bio is in the chat. I'm excited to tackle these issues both as a former practitioner, as a council member, but also to have a minute to step back and really dive into the research and the data. And I think that that's one of the key theories that I had as part of this fellowship, was that we sometimes don't explain to our communities why it is we're talking about zoning or land use with housing. We just tell them rather than showing them. So I wanted a project that allowed us to really dig in and demonstrate. I want to go back for just a second and show you, for anyone who joined late, some of the answers that were produced for Colorado's housing crisis. These were your answers as you joined the meeting. And we see a lot of the types of things, right? So high demand, restrictive zoning, a lot of land use type comments in here, but we also see things about the marketplace, right? Commodification, corporate ownership. So we see a bunch of different causal items here, and each of those might point to a different kind of solution. So I'm going to take us right to another test you guys can do. I don't think you're allowed to do reactions here in this format, but these are two different solutions to the type of problems that or two responses to the land use development solution to housing. And so Are these true or false? I want you just to think in your head. Is the fact that we develop more housing, it will help affordability? Is that true or false? And on the other side, you have some people who say new development has been happening and it hasn't helped. Is that true or false? So in your mind, just take a second to answer, and then I'm going to go to the answers that the data has. So there is actually evidence that a shortage of housing drives up prices and that we need to build more housing at all price points. This includes higher cost housing. And I say this as a very long time affordable housing advocate who focused almost exclusively on low and moderate income housing, including for people experiencing homelessness. I really investigated this question. Why and how does higher cost housing impact things? And you're going to learn the answers. And then new development hasn't helped. Denver saw, just one city, and we probably have people from around our state here. So I want you to know that I did look at other parts of the state too, but I have the data from Denver. It's easier for me to get. 34,000 new apartments in a decade. And we have 7,000 coming in 1 quarter just in our metro region. For those of you in suburbs, your housing is participating in this number. But the majority of that new housing is luxury and it's not affordable. And we haven't seen rents moderate. So both of these statements are true. How can that be? Well, stay tuned. So voters have the same kind of mixed feelings about development and growth in new housing as we just saw in the last slide. And so, for example, majority of them support ADUs, accessory dwelling units, a little casita behind the main house, a little mother-in-law apartment, maybe in the basement of a house. Depending on the poll you look at, maybe half of voters or majority of them support more density near transit, but they also have these mixed feelings about development. If you ask them how they feel about it, they'll say there's been too much or it's been too fast. They'll say these exact things. They feel like opposites, but that's how folks are struggling with these topics. And then if you ask them about policies that focus just on renter protection, some of those more market-based interventions that we saw in the first responses that you guys gave about commodification and profit, majority of voters support rent stabilization. They support inclusionary housing. So they don't just believe in land use as the solution. They believe in both these things, but they're also a little uncomfortable. So my framework was that we do need more land use reform and zoning and housing to have a role in the crisis, but that we need more understanding of who's actually helped by those strategies and ways to reach lower income households faster by adding funding or policies that kind of bump up the equity factor of those growth strategies. And then we also will always need other types of policies and funding, like the 123 proposition that was mentioned earlier, to help those below 60% of median income. I will say right now to you, that's for a household earning about $54,000 if they're a single person, $62,000 if it's a family of two, might be a little more or less in different parts of the state. And so that's the theory that I started with, that this project was trying to prove. And it began because I watched the land use reform efforts in the 2023 General Assembly. There was a big bill and it had accessory dwelling units and density and fourplexes and the end of single family zoning all in one bill for everyone in the state. And this was my illustration of how it ended. It did not pass. And then we had a different conversation in 2024. I'm going to turn it over now because I want to preface before I turn it over to Melissa that in other places, Colorado was not the first place to take on land use. Places like Minneapolis had done major zoning reform and land use changes, and also states like Oregon have really done a lot for like small duplex, fourplex zoning to add more density in gentle places. And they all began with partnerships between communities of color and other leaders forming these really sound foundational coalitions to really explain why this was good for diverse communities and why sometimes single family zoning and its history of exclusion was harmful to communities of color. And so that's how the conversations really began in some other places. That's not how they began here in Colorado. So I'm going to pass it to Melissa to talk a little bit about how her group started thinking about these things and how their conversations went.
Quickly, Robin, before we start on Melissa, we do have a question about the sentiments that you described. What was the source of that information about Coloradan sentiments about housing?
Thanks so much. So on the Bell Policy website that I know they will be sharing, which is they're the first paper on that website, is really a pretty short piece, and it cites all the polls that I took that data from. So I think Andrea might be able to help us by finding that link, and then you can see the source of each of the polls that are linked there. Thanks. And please do keep asking questions. We want to, make this as interactive as we can in the webinar format, but I'll turn it to Melissa now.
Yeah, thank you. And yeah, just quickly, I think there's actually, I believe, a lot of people on here who were involved pretty early on in this first round of bringing a land use bill, but ultimately it was a priority for the governor's office, for, a few members of the legislature, and there was a lot of involvement from environmental groups and initially from some sort of traditional housing groups. And this was, not foreign to those of us who have worked in housing in Colorado, but generally, land use and zoning runs in one lane, development, maybe affordable developers run in another lane, and then community and tenants' rights groups are sort of considered a totally separate issue area. And so we early on sort of pushed our way into having a seat at the table, talked to a few people, made sure that we made space for community groups in these sort of land use policy development conversations. And that happened in different ways over 2023 and 2024. But ultimately what happens, and the reason that it's so important, the way that it initially developed in other states, is that these changes have real impacts on communities, they have real impacts on households, and that without intentional design of statewide policies, you're going to exacerbate all of the housing problems that we are trying to solve for. And all of that burden is going to fall on those same communities that have already seen a ton of displacement and are already suffering the most. And so making sure that we have renters at the table, organizations pushing for affordability at the table, communities representing groups that are going to be most impacted by these changes at the table is really important in making sure that these are actually effective policies. You're still muted. You're still muted, Robin.
Thank you. The presenter mode. The good news is that the 2024 session really did bring more of these groups into the formation of some of the legislation that ended up coming out. And what's really important is you see a list here of a number of bills that were split into different pieces. So there's many things that changed the outcome in 2024 compared to 2023. Bills were separated by topic. There was a lot more engagement from local governments as well. But I think that part of the story I want to tell today is that what's really powerful about the Colorado example now is how it ended, because it wasn't just land use that was achieved. It was equity pieces in the bills. So there was, for example, on the 2024 side, funding for deep affordability in transit areas. There was funding for people to build ADUs who are moderate income. There was requirements in each of those bills to do other affordability policies on top of just changing zoning. There's in each bill, there's a menu, and you have to show that you're doing some of those other things. But there were also other bills that were totally outside the land use bill that addressed other pieces of the comprehensive response to affordable housing. So the biggest one is the for-cause eviction bill that Melissa's organization and many others, some of whom are on this webinar today, helped to pass. This is a picture from United for a New Economy. They were very active in that conversation. And there was also other improvements, right? So warranty of habitability ensures the safety of housing. These are things that we're going to see in a minute why they're so important to be balanced with the land use approach. And why I think Colorado is really now setting a good standard for local government implementation. So why is it so important that we have other strategies and funding? Well, this slide has a lot of numbers in it, but I want you to just look at the tallest bar on the left in the blue. That is the rent burden for people who are below 30% of median income. And that is about 27,000 for a household of one, about 31,000 for a household of two. 88% of those renters are struggling, compared to what you're going to hear a lot of in the land use debate is missing middle. Only 22% of renters statewide are struggling, and only 2 of them severely. There is almost no severe rent burden for people at that income level, but there's very severe rent burden the lower income you go. And also in terms of shortages. So if you look at the right columns, the least housing exists for people at that low income. So in this case, the lowest income bar is the one on the left. We actually have slightly more housing units than we need for people earning between 81 and 100% statewide. That doesn't mean your community has enough for that income level. And there are certainly renters experiencing burden at that level. But a lot of folks in that 80 to 100% level are looking at home ownership at that time, less about renting, and we have more supply statewide. So this just shows you why it was so important to think about those other equity considerations and not just all units. So who's helped by ADUs? So my papers that I looked at, I looked a lot at case studies from California and New Hampshire, but there's certainly examples from Seattle, Portland, and other urban areas. And then there's a few other states that will be coming online in the future, but mostly single adults at that 80% of AMI income. And you can see those incomes on the slide. You know, we talk a lot about elders in ADUs. We don't see a huge percentage of ADUs occupied by elders and older adults, mostly because they own their properties, and people who are in an accessory dwelling unit are renters. They don't want to give up home ownership for, renting. And then we see very few kids and disproportionately white higher income owners. And this is from data from Boulder, who tracks a survey of ADU occupants, and also from California has survey data. What about the transit-oriented communities? Those types of density near transit is going to help high-end earning renters. You're going to see in a second why that's helpful. And those who would benefit from an immediate rent increase. So maybe you can afford the market rent, but it's a stretch for you. If you build new housing within about 250 meters, you see an immediate rent decrease from $100 to $159. That's not very broad, but it does happen through that immediate competition. And then you also see buyers who are able to afford condos or townhomes more easily than they could have a single family home. Now, this does not mean every condo is going to be $300,000 to $400,000. Some might be $800,000, but on average, the average condo or townhome is about $200,000 and some $1,000 less in any given market than the single family equivalent in that same city or county. So here's why higher income housing can help, even though it doesn't seem intuitive to us. And I will just say the old story was if you build new housing, then the older housing will automatically become cheaper. It was called filtering, or some people called it trickle-down housing who didn't like it very much. That research exists, but it mostly shows that it takes decades for those older homes to really moderate very much in price. This newer research is showing effects much sooner. So right here, you can see, let's just start on the left-hand side. Brand new apartments built, they're likely very expensive. Who moves into them? Well, unless there's a tax credit project or an inclusionary policy, it's mostly high-income households who move in. They vacate a property. That property, odds are, according to the research, about 20% of those properties are going to be in neighborhoods with lower incomes. So some of those folks were what we call renting down. They were in a less expensive place and they just wanted to, they needed some place to live. So over time, each move opens up a different unit. And as the move chains go on, by the time you get to 6 moves, about 40% of the homes are freed up in a lower income area. Now, in the US, we have a hard time tracking the incomes of people. It's pretty confidential, but some international researchers have actually looked at the incomes of the people moving into those units, and they show that they are more moderate income and lower income than the original movers. So it's not just that they're in a lower income neighborhood, it's also that they're lower income folks. And so I'm going to now talk a little bit about who's helped if you do an equity add-on to these policies. So in the ADU category, that generally means financial assistance to the person building it. And it can also mean potentially linking that financial assistance to making sure that that unit gets rented, either to someone holding a housing voucher or to a moderate income family. These types of results are being found in my paper profiles really strongly the West Denver Single Family Trust Program, which is building 2 and 3 bedroom units for families. And they're often they're priced potentially as low as 40% of area median income, even though the requirements are for 80%. Many of them are housing family members and extended families, just the way we hear that story being told. But it took the extra subsidy and financial assistance to get there. Transit-oriented communities, this is really important. Our legislators who sponsored this and the governor's office put in new tax credit that will go directly to affordability in transit areas. They estimated about 680 units in transit-oriented areas with more density are going to be affordable with that tax credit. That's huge. So we know immediately some of that development from that zoning will be serving those who could be seniors or other very low-wage workers. And then we've already talked about those moderate income buyers being able to potentially find home ownership. If you combined that with some subsidy and made that unit permanently affordable through a land trust near a transit-oriented community, you'd be really layering your equity. So how much is this going to create? Well, I did a lot of calculations based on what cities and counties are currently producing for ADUs. That's all in the paper. And I looked at what California is producing. If we did something like what they did, which is about 3 ADU permits per year, then we might have 3,500 new ADUs permitted. That doesn't mean they all get built. Many of them get abandoned along the way. They're too hard, they're too expensive. So it's not a single solution. But if we had other areas of the state opting in, we might get to 5,000 a year. And then for density near transit, I don't have a number for you because it's going to take a lot of mapping of the zoning. Not every place needs to be rezoned. Not every place that's rezoned will be rebuilt. If it had a building built 5 years ago, that building's going to stay for a while. You have to do a lot of calculations, but I'm going to just share how long it's going to take. And I'll give you a minute to just look at this slide before I turn it over to Melissa to talk a little bit about other timelines. But the land use strategies to impact affordability, I'm a believer. The data was really clear that they are going to make an impact. Supply makes an impact, but it does take time. Some of the bills we're talking about aren't going to take effect until 2027, right? So full compliance with the transit-oriented communities bill doesn't begin until 27. And there's even a little bit of, wiggle room there. There are other bills that require local housing action plans. Those start in 28. So it may be 29, 30, 31 before projects are actually able to go through and be built, right? Construction takes 18 months, generally speaking, from, when you get, your project going. Affordable projects sometimes take 2 to 4 years to get going. So you can see we have a really long timeline, but it is important we're starting now because these things take time. It's good to start now. I don't want anyone taking away from this webinar that these timelines mean that these strategies weren't worthwhile, because they are, and the only way we get those results is by starting, and the land use and the zoning is an important first step. You can see when the timeline comes in for some of the affordability money, the biggest pots of affordability money are going to be in 28 and 29. They're 4 years away. So just giving you a sense, right? Patience are going to be required, but we know that our renters and our people trying to get into homeownership now right? They don't feel like they have a lot of choices. So I'm going to turn over to Melissa to talk a little bit about the timeline of what happens with some other types of policies. Melissa?
One more interruption right as we make the transition. We have a great question from Kinsey Hasted. So back on the topic of increased supply, does the newer research address the impact of landlord preference and who is most likely to actually be chosen to rent those 1 in 5 less expensive units that might be opened by a higher income household moving into a more expensive unit?
I don't recall reading anything specifically about that. What I will say is that even the pro is that lower, income units become, or lower priced units become available. But the challenge is that those units without any other policy protection would be vulnerable to increases in price should there be another surge in demand. So let's say you do have another population growth spurt and you've freed up, that's what I call this, a process of freeing up access to housing at a moderate price. Those units the rents could be raised, right? The sale prices could go up. And so I think that, but I don't know of any research specifically on the question of, basically what I think you're asking is almost a fair housing question, right? About, is there discrimination or other access barriers? And I don't have any data on that right in front of me.
Thank you. And before we go back to Melissa, there are just a couple more questions. People are really jumping in with this part of the conversation. So Marissa with AARP asks, she's working with the livable community space and says, one thing we hear a lot of is that we need older adults to sell the big houses they don't need anymore for younger families. Do we know of any incentive policies that would help older adults sell, i.e. interest rates, taxes, missing middle housing?
Yeah, it's a great question. I think that New Hampshire really, anecdotally, they didn't have a ton of data on this, but everybody who was interviewed in the New Hampshire research really said that the reason New Hampshire has success with its ADU legislation isn't necessarily because they had stringent requirements. It was actually pretty modest requirements in New Hampshire, but what they did was they have large lots and people who are older adults tend to have a lot of equity in their home already. They weren't needing financing because their homes were paid off. They'd paid off their 30-year mortgages in their older years. And so some of them did move into the smaller house, but not as renters, right? They owned both properties and they simply moved into the back house and had their families with kids, right? Kids and grandkids moving into the front house. So they didn't talk about the need for incentives for that, but they had a couple what we call naturally occurring things, which was large lots that made these easier to build, high amounts of equity, and a large older population. So those were the factors that drove it there, less so than subsidies or programs.
Yeah. And so I'll jump in with one thing that we did at the legislature this year, and then there's another ADU related question. This is not necessarily a new incentive, but it is removing a disincentive for those who are staying in a home because they receive the senior homestead exemption, which is, on average, a $500-600 property tax break every year. That was considered a disincentive to downsize because you would not be eligible for that tax incentive in the new property. We passed a policy at the legislature this year that does allow older adults who relocate, who previously qualified for the homestead exemption, to continue receiving that homestead exemption in their new property. So it was our hope at the legislature that would help make it easier for those older adults to downsize. So the other question about ADUs is from Kevin. He was curious if you if you look at the ADU production numbers before and after they removed owner occupancy requirements, and it sounded like there was something from California that may have been relevant here.
Yeah, so owner occupancy in most jurisdictions, including single cities like Portland, and then also the state of Washington recently got rid of and so I just want to explain what an occupancy requirement is. First of all, it means that if you want to, right now, if you have a single family home, you can rent that out to anybody. You don't have to live on site to supervise your renter. If you have a duplex, you can rent out both sides of your duplex. Those are expensive properties, right? A single family home, a duplex, you can rent them out. No one has to live on site to supervise your renter. But we have some built-in biases in some zoning codes that say that if you want to build an accessory dwelling unit in the back of your property, you as the owner have to live in one of those properties to keep an eye on your renter to make sure they behave well for the neighborhood. That's really the theory behind it. And so it's a barrier because if you're a moderate income person and you are trying to get lending, a lender is going to say, well, what happens if you get a job change and you have to move and it's a down market? This is a more expensive property to sell now. It's going to be harder for you to sell it. It's what if you get called to the military and you can't live there, right? Because you're deployed. Those barriers make it harder to get financing. And so the laws have removed that requirement, have seen a large increase in accessory dwelling units. There is some concern that or belief that having a owner occupancy requirement will limit developer speculation. There actually hasn't been a large amount of developer speculation statistically in the research. It doesn't mean it never has happened. Certainly Denver has had some cases of it happening. But there is an exception in Colorado's bill that allows the city to require that there's an owner living on the property at the time the permit is requested. But the idea is that if they have to move later, they can without any harm to the potential to pay back the loan. I do want to make sure that we go to Melissa, and we can take the rest of the questions at the end if that works, but I want to keep us going. Melissa has some important information to share about timelines when we move to the renter protection realm, as well as all of the mitigation displacement pieces that are put into this legislation. In part, it ties into this ADU question about what happens if there's risk of speculation. How do we mitigate that? So Melissa, I'm going to turn it over to you if that's okay. And Chris, we can go back to the questions at the end.
Great. And yeah, that's perfect because I was gonna jump in on the ADU question because I was unfortunately super involved in those conversations in terms of owner occupancy. And I think it's that is one of the challenges when we're, moving a local policy up to sort of a statewide version that makes sense. That owner occupancy piece does not make sense for all municipalities and certainly not for most markets. And also a lot of the testing ground in Denver for the way that these ADU programs have rolled out that have sort of really targeted how to have this be a tool for lower income communities in particular to have gentle density that's beneficial to the neighborhood and not harmful, really relied on some of that owner occupancy to not invite more of that speculation that was driving really rapid displacement and gentrification in parts of Denver. And so that's not necessarily a piece that makes sense everywhere and in other places with different histories. And so not including it in most policies makes sense, but that is a lot of why we had this conversation so much in Colorado is because really the testing ground was on a place that actually is impacted by that. And then that is all sort of a piece of the conversation that we really brought to the land use bills, but also with other things that moved at the legislature and did not do so well in 2023 and did a little better in 2024. But a lot of tenant protections and short-term protections. One of the things that's really important that we already sort of touched on a little bit is that these things take time. And if you think about that timeline, not only does it take time for all of these policies to pass and get implemented and really take hold and for people to understand them, land use and zoning changes do not equal housing. It doesn't just magically make housing happen. And then once you even get those projects and that development gets moving, that takes years. And in the meantime, there are thousands of families, renters, working people in the state who are not being helped by any of this, who maybe will be helped by the affordable housing that becomes more available or that is created through a lot of these policies. But right now, today, it does not help keep them in their home. And so it is really, really important to not only target the affordability and make sure we're creating those opportunities, but to have all of these policies that are addressing the conditions that people are living in now. And so some of the really big ones were the for cause for eviction that passed this year, and didn't do so well 2023. We got it through 2024, and Colorado now has the strongest for cause eviction state level legislation in the country, which is amazing. We also really improved the warranty of habitability, which just makes sure that homes are safe and healthy. It has all the requirements for a home to actually be livable, making sure that that actually works for tenants, that there's a requirement that work not just be started, but that it be finished, and prioritizations for accessibility, and then making sure we continue to have rental assistance and stability services. So that's sort of the long and short-term solutions. And then I will just go straight into this one. There were also a bunch of standards put into these bills. First showed up in 213 in 2023, ended up in a couple of bills this year, notably 1313 on transit-oriented communities, but really naming, identifying displacement and requiring that it be a factor in all of this development and in all of these local level policy changes, and that making sure that we are not displacing people as we are trying to create more opportunity is a part of this process. That sort of going back to what I was saying, these are not always the same conversation, have historically not been the same conversation. Land use and zoning has not been used to help the, people who are struggling with housing historically. And so trying to get that tool to be helpful is hard. And usually it's considered a special interest, and we're not necessarily the people at the table. And so this was a huge deal to make sure that all of the bills that ended up passing in 2024 not only named affordability as an intent of the policy, and that things needed to be that there has to be affordability included in all of this work, but that you have to have an understanding, if you're going to make these changes, of the risk of displacement of the communities in question. And if there is a risk of displacement, how are you mitigating that? And that can look a lot of different ways. But really getting this language in order to think intentionally about that and really understand that displacement happens to whole communities. It's not just individual families. It's not just upward mobility. That really uprooting of full communities is detrimental to all of us. Having that language in the state level policy is a big deal. And so really hopeful about how that's going to help guide the huge amount of work that is coming after these bills all passed.
Thank you, Melissa. We're going to just, kind of bring this all together. This is an image, that really represents what a comprehensive housing strategy needs to look like. And, there was a lot of emphasis on that red box supply, and it makes sense, but each of these pieces is important. So Melissa's work that her organization does with eviction prevention is about stability in existing homes, right? And, expanding access to existing homes, which is something, Kamala Harris has proposed, doing down payment assistance. That's something the mayor is talking about in his sales tax in Denver. Building and preserving dedicated affordable, that's what those tax credits do. And then, of course, the sheltering and rehousing strategies that bring people who are not housed at all into the strategy, right? Each of these pieces has a role to play. And I think that one of the goals of my fellowship is to suggest that more of these conversations, just like they did this prior year, they need to come together, sometimes in the same bills, sometimes in the same sessions, but certainly in the same plans. And so, if more housing advocates understand and have language to really see the supply benefits, they might be better partners at the table. But it also requires those who are developers and excited about market solutions understanding why these other boxes are so important and the immediacy of the impacts they can have compared to the long-term strategies. So with that, we're going to take your questions. I do just want to share, I have a third paper coming on inclusionary housing. It really counters some of the, things you might read in the paper about some of the data and development trends. We didn't have enough time in 1 hour to cover it with the detail, but either, maybe Belle will have me back, or if someone here wants to have a presentation on it, would love to present more. And I have some slides in the appendix if there are questions about it. But with that, I'm going to stop my share for a minute here and let Chris take over to give us some of his perspectives as a legislator and then take your questions.
Well, thank you so much, Robin and Melissa, for sharing these presentations about all the incredible work that's going on and what it means for the affordable housing landscape in Colorado this year. You know, I was not a lead on most of these housing policies at the Capitol, so I voted on a lot of them, but was not in a lot of these stakeholding meetings. So I think I'm even learning some interesting things about the nuances of what these policies are going to mean. So rather than me rambling on about thoughts there are some really great questions that people brought up. So we'll start with a question from Melissa. This is from Lori. To what extent is for-cause eviction neutered by the lack of rent inflation regulations? Can't a landlord just raise the rent exorbitantly to drive a tenant out? What are the chances of passing a % allowable increase in rent year over year?
That is the question. I mean, from a very high level, tenant protections in Colorado is tough overall. It is not unlike the land use conversation where, you know, this is generations of structures that we are trying to solve for. And it is not a friendly state to be a renter in. It's tough. And so was a pretty baseline thing. You know, it is one of the strongest in the country, but it does not include any sort of rent limitations. It does require a reason, but there is nothing right now because it is, you know, a question of property that tells you how much you are allowed to raise rents. That is in the state constitution. 2023, that was one of the bills that just removing that and, you know, giving that power to local governments on the table in 2023 did not pass. I would expect it to return. I think there's actually other people in the audience here who are a little more out front on that than I am, and who actually have been working on this longer than CDP's been around. But really that's the first step. And so, yeah, it creates a lot of protections. It makes our eviction attorneys' ability to keep people in their homes and do their jobs, you know, not easier, but better than it was. And it is, you know, one piece of a broader solution. So.
Thank you. Anything to add on that question, Robin? All right. So this next one you may both have some contributions to the answer. So Robin, in your presentation, you did mention community land trusts as a way of keeping units permanently affordable. But the question is, what are the prospects for increasing movement towards social housing in Colorado?
Well, I think that word evokes a lot of things for people as a word, and I would really invite you to get rid of the word social housing and think about types of public ownership and to understand that there are many different ways it can be done. And I think with that label, I think it's actually, there's parts of Proposition 123 that have public equity stakes in some of the buildings that are getting those equity. Equity is like down payment money. It's cash you don't have to pay back, or that you pay back, you know, at very favorable rates with some other parts of that proposition. There's a public stake there. There is, I think, a lot of interest in Denver from using some of the new sales tax dollars to think about mixed income buildings where the public ownership stake helps to ensure the long-term affordability, and not just think about what we thought of public housing in the past as just for the poorest of the poor, which in fact wasn't how it started, right? It started as working class, middle, you know, we didn't have the same middle class before in those years, but they definitely started there and then, you know, changed to being only the deepest, lowest affordability. And so I think that there's really exciting models. Chicago just passed something with public ownership. Atlanta is doing it, not what we consider a bastion of liberalism. So I actually think there's going to be a lot of investment in these mixed income buildings. I will just say that they have some downsides. I wrote about this on my Substack. If you want to read more about my take on these mixed income models with public ownership, you can check it out there. But there are some things to watch out for.
Melissa, anything to add? All right. So our next question is from Matt. So he's hearing that the regional disparity in regulations that add costs, including building codes and inclusionary zoning policies, et cetera, may be pushing development to jurisdictions with fewer regulations, which can be further from jobs, transit, and services. Do you have any thoughts on how to remedy this?
Can you repeat the first part of the question again?
Sure. So it has to do with regional disparities in regulations that may add costs to construction projects that may push developments to other jurisdictions.
Yeah, I think that I don't know what regulations in particular the asker has in mind. That's why I had you repeat it. But many communities have impact fees for water, for sanitation. When you build a property, you pay a per square foot fee. That's a fee in suburban areas. Denver doesn't charge those type of fees, but we charge an impact fee on commercial development for housing. Inclusionary exists and requires a portion of market rate units to be affordable, and it exists not just in Denver, but in 7 communities in the metro area. Some of the communities having the most development right now are in Boulder County, and Boulder County has really high inclusionary requirements. Lakewood doesn't have any inclusionary, and their permitting has dropped. So I do think that we do need to be aware of how these costs impact development, but my inclusionary paper really talks about how many market trends are involved, including interest rates, including how much land is available, including the market, right? There are things that you get living near transit that you don't get living in a far off suburb, and they are not going to be the same competitors for development, right? Even if there's a few more costs to build near transit. There's also been more public investment to make that land more valuable. So we have to think not just about the cost of regulations, but the value of public investment that makes development profitable. Where we've invested a lot of public resources in parks and open space, or in arts and culture, or in transit, we are giving more value to land. And therefore, we are also at times requiring more affordability in exchange for those investments.
Yeah. Thank you. And, since you mentioned my lovely city of Lakewood, I'll just mention for anyone who is not familiar, in 2019, there was a citizens initiative that put in place pretty severe limits on permitting for new affordable housing projects. And this has been something that's been a little bit of a struggle. The city council has done what they could to loosen those so that we could continue to build affordable housing. And the state legislature in 23 did pass a policy prohibiting those kinds of anti-growth policies at the city level. I do think that there's just a little bit of a lag in getting things up and running, but I will say I drive past a number of places that would be ripe for development. You think about, there's a question in the chat about East Colfax, but I think about West Colfax between Sheridan and Wadsworth in particular. This is a place that is still technically a food desert, a place where more affordable housing would be critical to helping revitalize the entire community, and it's very close to transit and economic opportunity. So I'm hopeful that Lakewood starts turning that around pretty quickly. So the next question, please.
I'm just going to add one piece, and Melissa, you can chime in, but folks have asked about, the gentrification implications of the state bill. And I've been answering that in the past, concentrations of growth were Melissa mentioned this, in a few neighborhoods. The thing the bill does is it spreads it out in more places, which actually protects communities that have been over-focused and spreads it out in more places.
Yeah, sorry, thank you. And I was just going to jump in. I was going to say a similar thing, like this is all the tough thing about this question about East Colfax and being next to Aurora and what Aurora is doing, or what Lakewood is willing to do versus Boulder. Like that's sort of why we really needed a higher level intervention, and that's why we need the regional coordination, because one city cannot solve the housing problems for a whole area. And the reality is we have local control, we have local government, we have municipalities that have different needs and different considerations and grew in different ways. But the things that happen there, the housing costs that happen there, the infrastructure investments that happen there, have an impact on all of the surrounding communities. And especially if you're talking about somewhere like Lakewood that doesn't want to create, that hasn't historically wanted to incentivize that growth, that's right next to the west side of Denver, that in fact is that area that is highly vulnerable. they're not in the same city, but what happens in one really matters for the other. And so having this level of coordination and requirement that everybody take on some of this is really important.
Indeed. And it looks like you got at some of what Lori was asking about in her question in the Q&A. So thanks for reading ahead on that one. So we'll now go to Robert's question. Are we also considering the transportation costs for lower income people related to what happens with sprawl? He says, I know the feds sometimes use an affordability index that includes not just housing costs, but also transportation costs.
Yeah, you know, what Robert's talking about for folks who may not know is something called the H+T index. And I actually I think that there's a lot of evidence that families save more when they live near transit. So that's why that transit-oriented community tax credit is so important. And it's why inclusionary policies that bring some affordability within market rate housing could be very impactful, because even if that, let's say that rental housing is at like 80% of median income, which is pretty high, just to give you the numbers, that's like $71,000, $72,000 a year for one person, 82 for two. It's pretty high. But if they did that, and those families maybe can give up car ownership, right? That really helps out. Maybe they have a lot of student loans and they can ditch the car and ride transit. Or if a lower income family with a voucher is able to rent that unit at 80% of AMI, that fits within a voucher standard. They might only have 30% of median income. They probably couldn't have afforded a car anyway, but now they live near transit, they can get to work. So yes, we should be measuring both of those things. I will say one of the weaknesses of the laws, and this isn't anybody's fault, right? But that's what you get to do when you're a fellow. You get to comment on things, is that they have very little data tracking requirements in them. And I think that's because the sponsors were trying to be thoughtful about the obligations that local governments were already going to be taking on. And so a lot of reporting sounded onerous. But the truth is, you know, if we don't have ways to measure some of this over time, it's going to be really difficult for us to know how we're doing. So that may be an area I would suggest the legislature take on in the future is more data gathering and reporting. I think it's a lot less onerous than actually just having to follow the law, and maybe small jurisdictions go last and you get it from big jurisdictions first. But it will be important to track not just how many people of what income live near transit, but how many of them really ditch cars and how many of them save, you know, because of that.
Thank you, Robin. Well, it looks like we've come to the end of questions, so I think we'll do a last call for, oh, there's another one. There we go. Good. So another question from Lori. What would you say to those who say that we can never build our way out of the housing unaffordability issue that is plaguing the whole country? If building isn't the answer, what are your thoughts about the success of basic income, even at lower levels, with accompanying low-level human support and getting lower income people into housing?
Melissa, you want to go first? I'll go second.
Sure. Like, do we set this one up to close on?
Pretty good closer. Yeah.
Yeah, as anyone who worked with me on the land use bills knows, you know, we cannot build our way out of this. Supply is a major part of why we are where we are, and it is not the only reason, and it is not the way that we are going to solve things on its own. It is something that we have to do. But this is all still market driven, and systems that, you know, were not set up to be friendly to people, and certainly not lower income people, and working families. And so that is really why it is a both and. Like, we need to build. We need the market rate development that needs to happen. We also need really intentional, affordable housing development. And that has to come in multiple models. Like, we have been talking about land trusts, and land trusts are great. And also land trusts do not allow those families to grow equity, but they do serve a lot of other, like, they are very useful for a lot of things. Like, there is no silver bullet. There is no simple solution to housing affordability. It is really exciting to feel like we found an answer. But that just doesn't exist. No one has solved it. We have to do all of the things. You have to create different opportunities for people. You have to create different levels of affordability. You have to create protections for those who are renting. And you have to build. So it is really enabling all of those things at the same time. And ideally, the work that I do is, as we're doing that, to try to work towards a world where there is more parity between renters and landlords, between, you know, home buyers and, you know, larger interests, between large landlords of multifamily buildings, and the people who are living in them, you know, making sure that everybody is on a more even playing field and that people have safe places to live just has to be built into all of this work that we're doing.
I have a snappy response, and I'm going to cite Rick Jacobus, who gave me this, which is that you're right. We can't build our way out of the housing crisis, but it will never get better unless we build. So that's, I think, a really important takeaway of the research and the data. And I will just say that I think I just want to add a little asterisk to Melissa's comment. I know someone brought up my differentiation between social housing and public housing. So there are many models of social housing. And I think the one in particular that a lot of people are thinking about when they use the term is rental apartments, like the Vienna model is like, and that's why I threw in the word public there, but there are many other models. And I think land trusts are a great example of like, that you actually do earn equity as an owner in a land trust model. It just isn't windfall profits if there is a major market upturn. So, but you also wouldn't have been able to buy a house at all if you weren't in a land trust, because it would have been too expensive. So the trade-offs of, all right, I get into homeownership I couldn't have gotten into otherwise, and the equity will grow in a modest rate, and then that home is affordable forever, right? I mean, a lot of what we've talked about in all of these policies is these subtle trade-offs, right? It's not the same as someone buying a market rate house and getting a windfall, but then that house isn't available to the next family because its value went up by 100 grand. So those are the trade-offs that we're talking about. I want to just say there was a question about the inclusionary paper. I think will hopefully be out by the end of November. And we'll be sure to share it with, you know, maybe folks who attended this webinar. We'll save your emails, and also it'll be on my channels, my social media channels, the Bell's website. So we can have more conversations about those topics that I see happening a little bit in the chat. But in the end, I guess the last thing I want to say before I turn it back to Chris is, I think that, you know, I'm hopeful you took away some new information here, but I see some amazing leaders, many of whom were involved in some of this legislation and do this work on a daily basis. The biggest takeaway I really want folks to have is we need to change the way we're having the conversation. And just like we paired them today, and just like we are slowing down, instead of making assumptions that everyone is with us when we say growth will equal affordability, it's not that simple, and we shouldn't treat people like they should believe it just because we put those two words together. We should slow down and show the math more, and then show how to make the math better. And that's what I hope. If you knew everything in this webinar, maybe that piece of how we do the work going forward can be the one takeaway for you. Thanks.
Well, on that note, Robin and Melissa, thank you so much. You're both incredible leaders in our community in different ways, driving policy solutions to make life better for people, make housing more affordable, and generally make our community a better place to live, work, and raise a family. So thank you again for all of your hard work. We look forward to future opportunities to collaborate on projects like this one. And to everyone who gave an hour of their day to these presentations today, thank you so much for your commitment to learning more about affordable housing in Colorado and how you can be part of the solutions as we keep working towards the future. Thanks again.